Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today, we have a special sponsored episode. Emily O'Brien is an epidemiologist, an associate professor in population health sciences at Duke University School of Medicine, and a faculty member of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Emily is also the principal investigator of the Hero Together study. Jessica Mega is co-founder and chief medical and scientific officer at Verily. Verily's mission is to develop the infrastructure and solutions to harness the profusion of health information for good. Their data-driven solutions across research, care, and innovation aim to improve the well-being of our communities. They're here today to talk about Hero Together, an opportunity for people working in healthcare who receive a COVID-19 vaccine to help the public understand how people do after vaccination. Emily and Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
So first off, I'm interested in hearing both your stories and your journeys to where you are today. Emily, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. So I'm an epidemiologist, and as you mentioned, an associate professor at Duke. I came to Duke as a postdoc at the Duke Clinical Research Institute and still do a lot of research there. But my faculty position is in population health sciences, which is a relatively new department here at Duke. I was a psych major in college, so I've always been interested in how behavior and social factors sort of impact decision-making around health. And so COVID has been a really interesting time from a research perspective. Early on in the pandemic, there were, of course, a lot of unknowns about transmission and risk and outcomes, best prevention strategies. And so, what do scientists do when there are unknowns? We collect data. And so I was, so excited to hear about this opportunity, this new research project called Hero, that would look at COVID-related burden in healthcare workers. And most of my excitement was really, not only that we were addressing critical questions related to risk factors and outcomes, and that those outcomes were broader than just infection rates, but also encompass psychological impacts like burnout, but also that we'd be doing this work in a population that was really critical to successfully managing the pandemic and had high risk for infection themselves. So it was, I think, a really nice opportunity to get involved with some really impactful research, and I've really enjoyed it so far.
And I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more about the study and the findings later in the interview. Jessica, please share your journey and story to where you are today.
Sure, thanks. So I'm a cardiologist. I've had the very good fortune of taking care of patients both at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Mass General, and now currently at Stanford Healthcare. And I think throughout the entire journey, it's really been important to think about best patient outcomes. And the only way we improve outcomes is generating the right evidence. And that's whether it's a new medicine, which we'll be talking about today, whether it's a new device or digital tool or even a care pathway. I found that one way of trying to improve patient outcomes was thinking about how do you bring together new technologies and healthcare. And it was with that in mind that I ended up joining Google. And at the time we were inside of Google X, we had teams of engineers and scientists and physicians coming together and trying to think about how could we bring these different disciplines and apply them in a way that would go back to improving patient outcomes and really making both patients and the clinician journey as powerful and as meaningful as it could be. And so with that in mind, we actually ended up forming a company under Alphabet called Verily. And so we spun out and we focused solely on this intersection of technology, healthcare, and life science. And one of the main programs that we've been working on is called Project Baseline. And it's this idea of how do you democratize research and how do you make it easier for people to participate in research, and building the tools that streamline research and ultimately lead to the best data. And so it was really fortunate that we were able to take these kinds of initiatives that we've been working on now for years and apply it to work during the pandemic. We've been involved in screening and testing programs, as well as the work we'll talk about today, which is really core of how do you reach out to people and understand the vaccines, certainly as they're going through phase 2 and phase 3 programs, but now importantly in this post-market era. So it's been a real journey. I think this has been a traumatically hard year for everyone, but I think being part of the solution has also been rewarding, and particularly the fact that we're working with healthcare workers, I think is something that Emily and I both feel so passionate about.
So the first part of this interview, I want to talk about the COVID vaccine and the concept of vaccine hesitancy. So Jessica, we're speaking in the middle of February now. What is the current status of the COVID vaccines in the United States?
So the United States certainly is working very hard to vaccinate the vast majority of the population. Now, we know that this is even more critical as new variants are being discovered. And vaccinations in the United States, they started in about mid-December. And as of today, according to the CDC, we have 46.4 million doses that have been administered, and 11.2 million people have now had both the doses. So the doses where we feel that they are considered fully vaccinated. And the current status is about 1.6 million doses of the vaccine per day, with the idea of continuing to ramp this up, because we know in order to get to the goal of having the majority of individuals vaccinated, we're going to have to continue to work extremely hard to get that done.
So the concept of vaccine hesitancy is not new. On my podcast and my blog, we talk about vaccine hesitancy all the time with older, more traditional vaccines. Now, Emily, what is vaccine hesitancy in your eyes? And can you just give it some context in light of the COVID-19 vaccines?
So I really like the World Health Organization's definition of vaccine hesitancy, which is a delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccines despite availability of vaccination services. So we look at overall vaccination rates. Of course, that's a combination of both how much vaccine is available as well as the number of people who decide to become vaccinated. And so I think what's really important to recognize about vaccine hesitancy is that it's not as simple as just a yes or no, I'm pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. It's really a spectrum. And so on one side of the spectrum, you have people who accept all vaccines almost no matter what. And on the other side, you might have people who refuse all vaccines no matter what. And the vaccine hesitant population is the group in the middle. And so these are people who might be accepting of vaccines, but have a little bit of doubt. People who accept vaccines but want to take a wait and see approach and sort of delay, or people who might accept some vaccines but not all. So really, when we think about ways to improve uptake, we're focusing on this middle group of people who are open to changing their minds about taking the vaccine, but it might take some education to do that. Interestingly, in HERO, we were really curious about how this looked in this healthcare worker population. And so the initial thinking was, healthcare workers, they might be more open to medical innovation than the general population, more familiar with the approval process. They're sort of trusted figures in their communities. They may look a little bit more vaccine willing than the general population. And so we did a quick poll to check on this in October that looked pretty similar to how a lot of the national polls around this issue have looked. Really a simple question: if a vaccine were available to you at no cost, would you take it, yes or no? And what we saw was about 46% of people at the time in October said no. And we asked them why, a very short list of reasons why they might be vaccine hesitant. And the overwhelming majority said that they had concerns about safety of this vaccine in particular. Very few said, I'm vaccine hesitant in general, or I'm concerned about safety of vaccines in general. But interestingly, we did repeat that poll. November was a crazy time here in the US. We had a national election where response to COVID and next steps was very high on everyone's agenda and an active area of discussion. Pfizer and Moderna also had top line results that were published in the news media that were really encouraging. And so we were curious to see how this changed. And when we conducted this exact same poll in late November, we saw an absolute increase in willingness of about 22%. So I think the good news here is that even in populations where there's some degree of hesitancy, as we saw, people can change their minds even without an explicit intervention if they're shown data that are encouraging.
And Emily, when you talk about the vaccine hesitancy spectrum, where do healthcare workers fall in that spectrum, and contrast that with the public?
Yeah, so from our data, we actually saw pretty good consistency with the general public. I'll also say that we looked at the data by professional roles. So we have a very broad definition of healthcare worker. It's anyone who works in a setting where people receive healthcare. So we had people who were in direct clinical care roles responding to the poll, as well as people who were in administrative capacities, transport, EMS, food services, et cetera. And what we saw was that there was a ton of variation by role. So physicians and paramedics, EMS personnel tended to be more vaccine willing. On the other side, nurses tend to be less vaccine willing. So I think there's a big range within our definition of healthcare worker. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of variability even over time, that from month to month, you take these snapshots and they're sort of helpful when grouped together in terms of getting at an overall picture. But I don't think there's any one right answer at any point in time for how people are feeling. It's important to really keep gathering data.
And Jessica, what are some ways that we can overcome vaccine hesitancy, both in patients and in healthcare workers?
I think what we're seeing across the board is what are the challenges or what are the barriers to vaccines broadly? And everyone, the world is watching this. So there's the vaccine supplies. And when we think about it, it's not just the vaccines, it's the cold storage and the syringes and needles and distribution. This is no small task, but I actually think there's been a lot of progress on that front, or people are talking about that. And in some ways, I think that starts to bring the other two pieces along. We need people to deliver the vaccines, and there are now channels for more and more people, including many people in healthcare who may not normally deliver vaccines, to step up and do this kind of work. And then there are people themselves, the individuals. And when we look at the top reasons why people may have vaccine hesitancy, we start to see things like, is this going to be safe? Do people understand the long-term safety? And that's something that Emily and I have been working a lot on, particularly with the Hero Together program. People are interested, is there something where, how do we know not only what happens in the short run, but happens in the long run? Again, another thing that we've been working on. And when it comes really down to it, it's the long-term information. And I think the final thing I would say is, over time, what we're starting to see is, if people who get the vaccine talk more publicly about it, not just the side effects, but people who talk about maybe they're severe side effects, they're people who may have even had symptoms that we know that feel flu-like. The more open people are with discussing the vaccines, I think the more it becomes a collective piece of information. And so again, on this vaccine hesitancy side, it's something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about, because these are real concerns. But I think with evidence and information, we as healthcare workers can make a huge difference, not only for our own community, but I think the broader community, as you start to think about teachers and you start to think about other frontline workers. So a real opportunity.
The next part, I certainly want to hear more about the Hero Together study. So Emily, what is Hero Together?
Hero Together is a prospective observational study of healthcare workers in the United States who've received a COVID vaccine in the past 60 days. And it's been a really wonderful partnership, as Jess mentioned, really thinking about how we can take research to people and make the barrier to getting involved with research in this post-vaccine space pretty low, so that it's accessible regardless of where people are in the country, and it should be relatively simple to join just from a smartphone, something that most people have access to. And so as I mentioned, for our population, the healthcare worker definition is very broad. We really want to make sure that our results are generalizable to a very diverse group of people, and maybe slightly different from where a lot of other COVID-related research in healthcare workers is focusing, which is primarily on the front line. So acknowledging that vaccines can benefit the entire healthcare worker community, we wanted that to be part of the study design. People self-enroll online. So as I mentioned, you can enroll from a smartphone. All of the surveys can be completed online. There's no in-person visit required. And essentially people sign up and we ask them how they're doing, if they've been hospitalized, if they've received any unplanned medical care, if they've tested positive for COVID, and sort of check in with them over time to make sure that we're able to see any outcomes in this post-vaccine period.
By the end of this year, there could be as many as 4 to 5 different COVID-19 vaccines. Emily, why is it important to keep studying vaccines even after authorization?
This is a critical question that comes up a lot, and Jess already touched a little bit on this, but really we see two key reasons why this is very important. The first is related to timing, and the second is related to the populations that have been studied so far. So as we all know, the safety data from phase 3 trials for the 2 vaccines that are currently being used were very encouraging, and there were very few adverse events in the vaccinated population from those trials. But those data were limited at the time of EUA review to a 2-month period after being vaccinated. And so as Jess mentioned, long-term studies are really central to addressing concerns about any long-term safety outcomes beyond that initial short-term post-vaccine period, and really to make sure that we can investigate any safety signals that come up in the period beyond the clinical trial period. And the second reason that I see as equally important is really sort of common to any evidence that's generated from clinical trials, which is that those populations tend to be more narrow than populations in the real world where these therapies are being used. And so I'm sort of acknowledging that there might be differences in patient characteristics between who was included in the trials versus not. Really studying these long-term outcomes in broad, diverse groups is an important way to address some of these evidence gaps. So the example that we point to often for Hero Together specifically is pregnant and breastfeeding women. So this was a population that was excluded from both the Moderna and Pfizer phase 3 trials. We can capture data, as women make decisions about vaccination and either become pregnant or already are pregnant at the time of vaccination. Finding out, how they're doing over time is going to be really critical, I think, to enhancing confidence, given that at the time of EUA approval, this is really a data-free zone.
Emily, how is the Hero Registry being used?
Hero Together is building on an existing community of healthcare workers, which is the Hero Registry. This is a PCORI-funded project that launched in April 2020, where healthcare workers respond to surveys about their experiences and perspectives related to COVID-19. So we ask questions about if they've been tested, if they've received positive tests. We have some data that we capture on quality of life, burnout, other psychosocial outcomes like depression. And we have a few different analyses that are ongoing related to employment characteristics and outcomes. Is there different risk, for example, of COVID depending on the setting where the healthcare worker is working, hours worked per week, et cetera. We also have an ongoing study on race and ethnicity and outcomes, given some of the reports of disparities, racial disparities in COVID-19. So there's active scientific work that's coming from that registry, and it's also an important opportunity for us to connect with registry participants, let them know about Hero Together, and invite them to participate.
And Jessica, why specifically focus on healthcare workers?
Healthcare workers have been at the forefront of this pandemic from the start. And I think that healthcare workers, and again, a very broad definition of healthcare workers, these include people who are working on the floors with patients who may be COVID positive, nurses, physicians, respiratory therapists, a very broad group of people who have had to come together and really be part of the solution. And as we thought about what individuals would we really want to hear from, because we think about this in a way when someone gets a vaccine, sometimes they don't know who's following them. They don't know that there's a safety net, that there's a group of people looking to make sure that the best evidence is there. And that's the whole goal of Hero Together, of following individuals who have received the vaccine. But again, because healthcare workers have been on the forefront of the solution, it's that same spirit of engaging with them. It's almost an obligation to make sure that healthcare workers are part of this very generalized study. I think Emily said it so nicely. I have spent much of my life conducting phase 3 clinical trials. There's a huge role for that, understanding the efficacy, understanding the safety. But when you start to think about the millions of people who are going to be vaccinated, the millions of healthcare workers and the millions of people broadly, we need to get a group of individuals so that we know the data is applicable and we know that we're doing the right thing. And so I think healthcare workers have been champions on the forefront for the last year, and it's another place I think where one can contribute, but we also get the knowledge back to these individuals. As I said, I think it's an obligation that we have.
You're listening to a special sponsored episode of the podcast by Kevin, MD. Emily O'Brien is an epidemiologist and associate professor in population health sciences at Duke University School of Medicine. And Jessica Mega is co-founder and chief medical and scientific officer at Verily. And they're here to talk about Hero Together, an opportunity for people working in healthcare who receive a COVID-19 vaccine to help the public understand how people do after vaccination. Emily, you've been polling healthcare workers throughout the pandemic. What are some of the things that you've learned?
Yeah, so I'll say that COVID has thrown a wrench in the way that we typically do clinical research. I mean, we really like to have a set approach to data collection, and for that to sort of stay the same over the course of the project. And things change much more quickly in the era of COVID. And so recognizing that, we wanted to put in place a mechanism where we could hear from healthcare workers on an ongoing basis about topics that everyone was talking about. So in addition to some of the vaccine hesitancy data that I mentioned, which was one of our early polls, we also have asked healthcare workers about financial burden. This is data that we've analyzed really within the past week or so. And we've seen some interesting things from this poll. 34% of healthcare workers reported that they were more worried about meeting financial obligations now than in the pre-pandemic era. About a quarter reported reduced income, and about 18% reported reduced work hours. So this is a topic that's gotten, I think, a little bit less attention than infection rates and psychological impacts. But what we're finding is that the burden of COVID, it really extends beyond some of the more proximal effects that we're seeing, with financial burden being one of those. We also asked healthcare workers in the fall if their parent or guardian had school or daycare changes impacted their ability to work. And we had some very basic high-level things that we asked about: being distracted, anxious, et cetera. And we saw quite a bit of burden here too. So 28% said that they were more distracted at work. About a quarter said that they were more anxious. 15% said they were struggling with childcare issues. And importantly, we did see some racial and ethnic disparities here too. So more burden of anxiety, more distraction reported in Hispanic and Latinx participants relative to non-Hispanic participants. So I think it's really important for us both to be agile enough to capture these data, but then to really disseminate them widely so that there's a better understanding of the diverse ways that that this pandemic is affecting such an important population.
How can the data from Hero Together help build vaccine confidence at the individual level and at the community level?
I think across the board, people have been thinking about how do you think about the individual with personalized care and personalized health, and then also thinking about community and population impact. And I think here, when we think about it on the individual level, there are millions of people getting vaccinated, and they may not know how or where to share their own journey. And in some cases, it may be that they had a very smooth sail. There may be other cases where it's critically important to understand and share their event. This is a way to be personally heard, and we hear that from people once they've learned what's going on. The number of people who say, "I didn't know where to contribute and where to think about this longer term data." So I think on an individual level, we're getting incredibly positive feedback. On a community level, it's so important because sometimes when we talk about this in medicine all the time, and I think you'll relate to this, we think about a case in front of us, we treat that individual, but really when we practice medicine just by case by case, we don't really understand the totality. We don't know what's really going on or the frequency of given events at a broader level. And I think it's only through these kind of community-based efforts where we're all collectively coming together that we end up practicing the best medicine. And so I think that there's both individual benefits as well as community benefits here. And it's really, I think, very fortunate when we see these two things come together.
Why should healthcare workers join Hero Together?
So I think healthcare workers are actually really proud of being vaccinated. They have needed to go and put themselves in the front lines. I think many people have had some of the most rewarding times in their careers. And again, a very broad definition of healthcare workers, as we've already discussed, but it's also been really tough. And we see people, we see the selfies out there. We celebrate each other for the ability for them to be vaccinated. And I think joining Hero Together is just that next step. And we've worked really hard to bring the barriers of getting into this evidence generation community down. And I think with that in mind, this is the next step of being part of the solution. So congratulations for everyone who's been getting vaccinated. And now's a moment to make sure that you're followed and you're heard in this healthcare community called Hero, and particularly in Hero Together. So that's the way I think about it.
And Emily, after joining, what exactly is involved and what is the commitment?
So after joining, we'll send emails to participants to ask them to complete short surveys to tell us how they're doing. Again, any health events that they've experienced and some basic details about their event. We're also collecting some information on quality of life and fatigue over time, again, so we can hopefully characterize some of this additional burden that healthcare workers are experiencing. The surveys are clustered together every few weeks to start, and then they spread out over time. So it's every few months after that. And then in the second year, it's just 3 surveys that they complete. And for most people who haven't had any unplanned care, the surveys will be really quick and easy. Participants are also compensated for their time. And as Jess mentioned, it's really important for us to share results as we go, let people know what we're learning and how their data are being used, so that they can really see the contribution that they're making at the aggregate level.
And on average, how long does it take to complete a survey?
For most people, it really should be 5 to 10 minutes over follow-up. We do collect a little bit more detailed information at the enrollment survey, just to make sure that we understand the setting where people work and any past medical history that might be relevant. But again, for most people who haven't had any unexpected care or hospitalizations, anything like that, it's just a really quick check-in.
For those interested in joining, how can you do that?
So people can go to heroesresearch.org. That's heroesresearch, one word, .org, and look for the link to Hero Together. As I mentioned, signups all online, and everything is through our website. So it's heroesresearch.org.
Wonderful. So I want to end this interview with a take-home message from each of you. Jessica, we'll start with you. What's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Being a healthcare worker over the last year has been, I think, putting people in some of the most trying, but some of the most rewarding opportunities they've ever had. And it's now our time to continue that. And there just has never been a more important moment to be part of research, to be part of the vaccination, to be part of the long-term study, and join Hero together.
And Emily, what is your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Jess, that was perfect. I would also just add a thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done over the past year. And we can't wait to hear from you. So please join us.
Wonderful. Well, thanks to both of you for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.